Hello, who am I? I'm Beverley Skeggs. I'm the current director of the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities at Lancaster University. I previously worked at a range of universities, including Lancaster before, but also at Worcester, York, Keele, Manchester, Goldsmiths and the LSE. What do I do? I study inequality. I've studied inequality in its various different manifestations all my life. So I've looked at class and gender, gender, race and sexuality, processes of racialization, and lots of different processes as they occur over different sites. So I've looked at caring institutions, education, television, especially reality television with Helen Wood, who's also in the department. I've studied violence, studies of queer spaces with Les Moran, and looked at how Facebook works. That was my last project. So I've had quite a lot of funded research projects, which I'm very grateful for, that have allowed me to go into depth on various different topics. So that means I kind of study a range of topics, but also a range of different spaces or sites. So I often look at the global picture and then work out how that manifests at a very, very local level, including particularly at the intimacy of people. So my very first piece of research that came from my PhD was how young white working class women formed a caring subjectivity through defending themselves against middle class judgment. So it was about class-gender relations, it was related to local employment possibilities, and it was related to how they generated value for themselves through respectability, but a very different form of respectability than the one that was being imposed upon them. Now, this means, and I only worked this out when I applied for a research project on a sociology of values and values, that I've actually been looking at how economic values work with and refigure, kind of in a dialogical engagement with each other, between economic and moral values. So that's one of my key focuses, is to think about how do they relate to each other? How does a moral economy relate to a monetary economy, for instance? And that led to me studying religious faith for a short period of time, to think about how does faith get monetized and what does that mean for moral values, but then also studying Facebook that monetizes social relationships, that monetizes friendships in particular. And so this means I've kind of been thinking through the relationships between things and how these take shape and how we know them, So I'd argue that the media and the symbolic economy has always been very central to what I've done. And I actually wrote a book on the media in the 1990s, always been central, because I want to understand what images people have of things, what representations they operate with in their relationships to one another. So I am currently fascinated by, and it is curiosity that leads me into all these different areas, with an underpinning of how inequality needs changing. But it's curiosity that at the moment has led me into thinking, how do we understand the new forms of capitalism that we see emerging? So there's been lots of fantastic research on new forms of what's called rentierism. So if you imagine a Facebook platform that extracts rent from you by selling you back to users. Lots of other forms of rentierism, obviously, in terms of things like property, but also new forms of financialization. So how debt has become a really important mechanism by which people survive. You know, the majority of debt that is not national or state debt is actually used by people to buy food, to buy everyday goods. So how debt has become central to everyday lives, and that's usually working populations. So it's how debt plus labour work together in new forms of capitalism. So I'm fascinated by new forms of capitalism, because for the first time we see capital as a stagnant force. It isn't this dynamic growing thing that extracts everything in its wake, including air and water and everything that we need to survive. It's actually stagnant, and we see a real surplus of global labour. So what does that mean for how we understand inequality that has nearly always been premised on some understanding of work in some way? So I'm curious, and I need to work on it more, but it's that curiosity that leads me into particular areas of inequality. So I'm hoping to study that in the future. I'm also still really interested in computational capitalism, platform capitalism, algorithmic capitalism, and how, you know, there isn't hardly anything in our lives that has not been platformized, or however you want to term it, that isn't subject to some form of algorithmic calculation in some way. And what we know is those algorithms are really classist, racist, sexist, and produce all sorts of divisions. So we saw that when I did research with Simon Ewell on social media, how social media creates phenomenal inequalities by stealth based on monetizing your value. So I'm still really interested in that side of things, in the computational side of things, alongside these new forms. And I'm interested in these because I want to understand how they manifest personally. What does it mean for us as we live these relationships? What does it mean for how I think of myself as a person, my subjectivity, my identity? How does that impact upon my relationships with others? You know, if all I see is the performance of a persona on somebody's social media site, when I meet them in real life, I probably react to them very differently. So I'm really interested in the kind of how the big structures of capitalism that shape our lives, that, you know, leading to horrific forms of catastrophe. I'm interested in how they actually really get lived as embodied and as intimate. And how do I do this? Well, historically, I've used a range of different theories which really have taken shape right from the start through Marxism, feminism, queer theories, anti-racist theories, and trying to find out what are the best explanations for the matter at hand. So if I want to study social media, I will initially begin with obviously a kind of economic theorist, somebody who can help me explain what's happening in a big picture. So Marx would be my obvious go-to point to begin with. But then as I start understanding things a bit more, I'll move into looking for theories that can help me explain more detail. So software studies would be more significant, and then thinking about people like Kostas Lapavistas and financialization. So I'm always searching for the best explanation, and I will produce that framework depending on the matter at hand and who has produced the best research on this, and then I'll try and put it together. So when I was looking at formations of class and gender, that is actually an amalgamation of feminist theories, anti-racist theories, because for me one of the most important theorists in the world is Angela Davis, put together with various different ways of understanding how social reproduction itself works, and who does the work of social reproduction. So I use theories depending on who's significant. I got completely absorbed by Pierre Bourdieu, the French theorist, because of his theories of cultural capital and symbolic capital to explain inequality. So he became very important for a while, but I just realised that his analysis didn't help me explain gender. It could explain power, but it couldn't explain how those subjects of power behaved in particular ways and how their subjectivity was formed. So I wrote a critique of Pierre Bourdieu, did a book with Lisa Adkins, because I needed to think through the usefulness of that theory. So I use theories and try to put them to work. And methods, again, I'll use which methods seem appropriate for which particular project. So there'll be no point for me doing longitudinal ethnography, which is what I did for the Formations book, if I was studying social media, because you couldn't study it in the same way. It doesn't have the intensity of the relationships. Likewise, using software to study people's engagement with a media platform wouldn't make sense. But we've experimented with different methods, and that's why I like working with other people. When I did the reality TV research with Helen Wood, who's a media scholar, she taught me how to really understand the technical media processes of narrative construction, character building, the mise en scène, the use of music and things like that. And so that became a detailed textual analysis. But then we built in audience analysis into that research. So we were experimenting with what actually worked and how it worked. When we did the software research, Simon Yule, a genius software designer, built software that could actually, we thought, track people's Facebook use, but actually, because Facebook was collecting every single thing you did on the computer, laptop, phone, we realised we were collecting that too. So it was a method that produced all sorts of challenges, but was appropriate for that particular object of study. So I use lots of different methods. I've done lots of quant stuff, survey stuff, long-term ethnography, mixed methods put together. I just think you work out what you want to understand and then you use the methods that are most appropriate to it. And why do I do all this? Well, I want to change the world still. I actually believe inequality is wrong. I think it's getting much worse. I hate to see people being targeted and blamed for things that are absolutely not their problem. I hate the way that a language of psychology is kind of taken over from structural analysis. So people get blamed for their individual lack of aspiration if they're unemployed, rather than the fact there aren't any decent jobs in their area. So, you know, I'm still very engaged. I'm very angry about the inequality we have, and I am particularly angry about the lack of care that seems to exist in this world. So I will keep researching issues in order to try and identify ways in which we can hopefully challenge things and actually make a difference in the world. So that's me. Thanks.